$25,000, Blake said, sliding the check across the lawyer's desk. Take it, Ethan. That land is nothing but weeds and rocks. Owen looked down. Mrs. Price stopped writing. Ranger, the old German shepherd, rose from under Ethan's chair and pressed his muzzle against Ethan's hand. Ethan didn't touch the check. He only stared at the final line of Grandpa Arthur's will. 72 acres, standing timber, and everything rooted there. Blake smiled. Be smart for once. Ethan closed the folder. No. Nobody knew that buried beyond Pine Hollow Road was the one thing Arthur had protected for 40 years. When Arthur Walker died, his 3 grandsons learned exactly what a man could leave behind, and how quickly love could turn into arithmetic. Blake took the nursery. Owen took the house. The bank accounts, clean and easy to count, were split between them with the neatness of a knife through warm bread. And Ethan Walker, 41 years old, a veteran with a careful limp and a silence people mistook for coldness, was handed 72 acres at the far end of Pine Hollow Road, a forgotten tract of Pennsylvania hillside everybody in Millstone Ridge had written off as brush, stone, and trouble. Blake even shook his hand across the lawyer's desk. The way a man shakes after closing a deal he knows he won. You always liked quiet places anyway, he said, his smile soft enough to pass for kindness if a person did not look too closely. Ethan did not answer right away. He looked down at the folder in front of him, at the black letters that carried his grandfather's final wishes, and felt Ranger shift beside his chair. The German shepherd had been lying still all morning, his sable head resting on his paws, ears tilted toward every breath in the room. Now he stood. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just enough that the old pine floor gave a single tired creak beneath him. Ethan felt the dog's muzzle touch the back of his hand, warm and steady like a reminder. The lawyer's office sat above First County Bank, up a narrow stairwell that smelled of dust, radiator heat, and coffee left too long on the burner. Outside, late November pressed gray against the windows. Inside, Mrs. Helen Price adjusted her glasses and kept her voice even, the way lawyers do when grief is too close to the furniture. Arthur had kept the will simple, she said. The Walker family nursery, including the storefront, greenhouses, delivery truck, equipment, inventory, and business name, went to Blake with the expectation that it remain a going concern. The house on Maple Quarry Lane, where Arthur had spent nearly 50 years watching the seasons move across the porch boards, went to Owen. The savings, $180,000 between 2 accounts, went to Blake and Owen in equal shares. Then Mrs. Price turned the final page, and there it was. One sentence so plain it seemed almost careless. To my grandson Ethan Walker, I leave the 72 acres beyond Pine Hollow Road, including all standing timber, water rights, and everything rooted there. For a moment the room became very quiet. Ethan could hear the faint tick of the wall clock, Blake breathing through his nose, Owen turning his cap in his hands the way he always did when he wanted to say something, and could not find the courage to pay for it. Blake leaned back first. He was 46, broad through the shoulders, silver just beginning to show at his temples, the kind of man who wore polished boots to a funeral and made people believe it was respect instead of presentation. Ethan, he said, lowering his voice as if gentleness made ownership less ugly. We can make this right. That land's nothing but scrub. Grandpa hadn't done a useful thing with it in years. I'll give you $25,000 for it today. Clean, no hassle. You can walk out of here with something real. Something real. Ethan let the words settle. He had heard that phrase before, usually from men who only trusted what could be weighed, sold, or put behind glass. Ranger pressed closer to his leg. Ethan looked at Owen, who stared at the floor, jaw tight, thumb worrying the brim of his cap. Owen was not cruel. That was the hard part. Cruel men were easier to stand against. Owen was only afraid of being left on the wrong side of a stronger voice. Grandpa knew what he was doing, Ethan said at last. His own voice sounded rough to him, unused in a room that expected him to fold. Blake gave a small laugh, not loud enough to be called insulting. Did he? He was 92, Ethan. Ethan closed the folder. He knew. The handshake came after that. Blake reached across the desk, firm and warm, giving the room a performance of brotherhood. Ethan took his hand because refusing would have made the moment smaller than it was. Ranger watched Blake without moving, eyes amber and level, as if measuring something no one else had the patience to see. By sundown, Millstone Ridge would know the story. Blake had the business, Owen had the house. The money had two new owners, and Ethan Walker, who had come home with a limp, a quiet dog, and no talent for asking pity from anyone, had inherited 72 unwanted acres at the end of a road nobody drove unless they were lost. What nobody knew was that Arthur Walker had spent nearly 40 years walking that land alone, with a grafting knife in his coat pocket, a notebook under his arm, and a faith so patient it looked like foolishness from the outside. And what nobody knew, not Blake, not Owen, not even Ethan yet, was that Ranger had been there before. Ethan Walker had been back in Millstone Ridge for 9 months, though no one who saw him at the diner counter or passing the post office would have said he had come home. Coming home was supposed to have weight to it, a porch light, a familiar hand on your shoulder, the smell of supper drifting through an open window. Ethan had returned with 2 duffel bags, a medical discharge folder he kept in the bottom drawer of his dresser, and Ranger riding in the passenger seat like he had a right to the road. The town remembered Ethan mostly in pieces. Arthur's quiet grandson, the one who could graft a pear branch before he was old enough to drive, the one who left in uniform, the one who came back older than 41 had any business looking. He was not a large man in a showy way, but there was something held together about him, something braced. His dark hair had begun to gray above both ears, and the old injury in his hip made him pause before stairs, though he never let the pause become a complaint. His eyes were a muted green, watchful but not hard, the eyes of a man who had learned that silence could be shelter if you stood inside it long enough. Ranger knew better. Ranger knew the difference between peace and shutdown. The German Shepherd was 7, sable-coated, broad-chested, with a black saddle across his back, and one pale scar above his right eye from a fence wire accident years ago. He had not been trained for tricks or parades. He had been trained for steadiness. At night, when Ethan woke before dawn with his hand clenched around nothing, Ranger would rise from the rug without being called and press his weight against the side of the bed. No barking, no whining, just weight. Warmth, presence, a living anchor. Ethan had learned to breathe again by counting the rise and fall of that dog's ribs. Arthur had liked Ranger from the first day. That one listens with his whole body, the old man had said, standing in the yard behind the nursery, his hat pulled low against the sun. That was 4 years before Arthur died, back when his hands still looked strong around a pair of pruning shears, and his knees still obeyed him most mornings. Ethan had only been visiting then, staying 3 days because 3 days was all he trusted himself to give. Arthur had not asked where he hurt. He had not asked why Ethan watched doors, why he chose the corner table, why sudden laughter across a room made his jaw tighten. Arthur simply handed him a flat of young rootstock and said, "Help me with these." That was his way. He never dragged pain into the light. He put work beside it and waited. When Ethan was a boy, Arthur had done the same. After Ethan's mother moved west and his father disappeared into his own bitterness, Arthur gave him a place in the propagation house, where mist hissed from overhead pipes and the air smelled of damp soil and green things trying. Blake and Owen worked the sales counter, the loading dock, the side of the business that wore the Walker name in red letters on a white truck. Ethan preferred the back. Arthur taught him how to slice a graft clean, how to read a leaf's yellowing edge, how to know whether soil was hungry, drowned, or tired. Most folks look at what's blooming, Arthur would say. You look at what's holding it up. Ethan did not understand then that the old man was talking about more than plants. As the years went by, Arthur spent less time at the nursery and more time vanishing beyond Pine Hollow Road. He would leave before sunrise with a thermos, a canvas satchel, and one of his weathered notebooks. Sometimes he took Ranger after Ethan came home for good, and the dog had decided the old man was part of the pack. Arthur always came back with mud on his boots and a satisfied quiet in his face. "What's out there?" Ethan asked once, leaning against the porch rail while Ranger slept between them. Arthur smiled the slow smile that made people wait for it. "Things that won't make sense to a man in a hurry." Ethan had meant to ask again. People always mean to ask again. But Arthur's health narrowed the days. There were pills to sort, appointments to drive to, invoices Blake complained about, house repairs Owen promised to finish and forgot. Ethan became useful because being useful was easier than being known. He fixed gutters, cooked oatmeal, changed furnace filters, sat with Arthur through long afternoons when neither of them said much, and somehow everything important seemed present anyway. Still, even while sleeping under the same roof, Ethan felt like a visitor in his own life. The town nodded at him kindly. Blake tolerated him. Owen avoided the shape of old guilt. Only Arthur and Ranger seemed to understand that a man could return to a place and still be standing outside the door. And now Arthur was gone, leaving behind a folded flag from another life, a nursery Ethan no longer belonged to, brothers who spoke of fairness like a price tag, and 72 acres nobody wanted. That night after the will, Ethan sat on the edge of his narrow bed in the small rental cabin outside town. The folder lay unopened beside him. Ranger rested his head on Ethan's knee, eyes lifted, patient as moonlight. Ethan placed his hand between the dog's ears and whispered, "What did he leave us, boy?" Ranger did not move, but his ears tilted toward the dark window, toward Pine Hollow, toward a road Ethan had spent half his life not taking. The morning after the funeral, before the town had finished carrying Arthur Walker's name from one porch to another, Ethan found himself back in Mrs. Price's office with the will open on the desk and the whole future laid out in paper, ink, and silence. It was strange, he thought, how a life that had smelled of potting soil, pine boards, black coffee, and rain on greenhouse glass could be reduced to pages held together by a brass clip. Mrs. Price had read the words once already, but Blake asked her to clarify the business assets, and then Owen asked about the house boundaries. And soon the grief in the room had been replaced by measurements, accounts, and legal descriptions. Blake leaned forward when the nursery was mentioned. He did not smile. Not exactly, but something in his face sharpened. The greenhouses, the inventory, the delivery contracts, the Walker name, the truck with faded red letters on both doors. All of it passed to him as smoothly as if he had been waiting with both hands open. Owen sat beside him, shoulders folded inward, listening as the house on Maple Quarry Lane became his. Ethan watched his middle brother blink hard at that. Owen loved that house in a helpless, guilty way. He loved its porch, its old maples, its kitchen window looking out over the herb beds Arthur had kept even when he could barely bend. But love and relief are sometimes hard to tell apart, especially when a man has spent years needing something he was ashamed to need. Then came the savings. $180,000, split cleanly between Blake and Owen. Mrs. Price said it without decoration, but Blake gave a little nod, as if the number confirmed a private belief he had carried into the room. Ethan felt no surprise. That was what bothered him. He had spent the last year driving Arthur to appointments, changing bandages after minor procedures, reading seed catalogs aloud when Arthur's eyes tired, sitting beside him on nights when the old man woke confused and asked whether spring had come yet. Still, Ethan had expected nothing. A man who expects nothing cannot be cheated in the usual way, but he can still be reminded how little others believed he deserved. When Mrs. Price finally read his portion, the sentence sounded almost embarrassed by its own simplicity. 72 acres beyond Pine Hollow Road. Standing timber, water rights. Everything rooted there. Blake was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he exhaled through his nose and looked at Ethan with that careful expression people wear when they are about to insult you gently. "Listen," he said. "Nobody has to walk out of here feeling shorted." Ranger lifted his head beneath Ethan's chair. Blake went on, warming to his own generosity. "That land's been sitting useless for decades. Taxes, maintenance, liability. Honestly, it's more burden than gift. I'll cut you a check for $25,000 today. You sign it over. We keep things simple, and Grandpa's place stays in the family." The phrase almost made Ethan smile. Stays in the family. As if Ethan were not sitting 10 feet away. As if family meant whoever had the keys, the deed, the storefront, the bank balance. Mrs. Price looked down at her papers. Owen's thumb moved again and again along the edge of his cap. Ethan could feel something old opening inside him. Not anger exactly, but recognition. He had seen men disappear in rooms like this without anyone raising a hand. A person could be erased politely. All it took was a calm voice, a reasonable offer, and enough people pretending not to notice. Ranger stood then, slow and deliberate, and laid his chin on Ethan's thigh. The weight steadied him. Ethan put one hand on the dog's head and looked at Blake. "No," Blake frowned. "No, I'll keep what he left me." Owen finally looked up. His eyes were wet, though whether from shame or relief, Ethan could not tell. Blake leaned back, the kindness draining from his face in small degrees. "You don't know what to do with land like that." Ethan closed the folder and rose carefully, letting his hips settle before he put weight on it. Maybe that's why he left instructions in the part you didn't ask about. No one spoke. Even Mrs. Price paused with her pen halfway to the page. Blake's jaw worked once, then stopped. Outside, a truck passed below the window, tires hissing over wet pavement. Ethan turned toward the door, Ranger at his side. And for the first time since Arthur died, the sorrow in him had a direction. It pointed beyond the bank, beyond the nursery, beyond the house that no longer belonged to him, toward Pine Hollow Road, and whatever his grandfather had trusted him to find there. Pine Hollow Road began where the county stopped pretending to care. The pavement ended just past an abandoned feed store, giving way to a strip of packed red dirt ribbed by old tire tracks and raincuts. Ethan drove slowly, one hand on the wheel, the other resting near Ranger's shoulder. The German Shepherd sat upright in the passenger seat, nose lifted to the cracked window, breathing in the cold morning, as if it carried a message written for him alone. November had stripped the hills down to their bones. Bare branches scratched at the pale sky. Fence posts leaned under the weight of years. Every few hundred feet, Ethan saw signs of people who had once meant to build something out here and then changed their minds. A rusted gate, a collapsed mailbox, a stone wall swallowed by multiflora rows. By the time he reached the turnoff, marked only by 2 granite posts and a sagging chain, he understood why everyone in Millstone Ridge had laughed at the land. From the road, Arthur's 72 acres looked like neglect made permanent. Brush crowded the entrance. Dead vines hung from young maples. A weathered board nailed to a cedar post still showed the faintest ghost of painted letters, but time had taken the name. Ethan parked beside the gate and sat there longer than he needed to. The engine clicked softly as it cooled. Ranger did not wait for permission. He gave one low breath, not a bark, not a whine, just a sound of recognition, and looked at Ethan. "All right," Ethan said. "Let's see what he left us." The chain was not locked. That surprised him. The metal was brown with rust, but when Ethan lifted it, the links moved freely, as if someone had oiled them not too many seasons ago. He stepped through first, favoring his right hip, and Ranger slipped beside him with the calm confidence of a dog entering a place he already understood. The first 100 yards confirmed every insult Blake had offered. Briars caught at Ethan's jeans. Fallen limbs blocked the old track. The ground was uneven, stitched with roots and stones. But then Ranger slowed. His ears came forward. He lowered his nose, not to chase a scent wildly, but to follow a line. Ethan watched him move through the brush with odd precision, pausing at certain trunks, circling others, then returning to the same narrow path under the leaves. That was when Ethan saw the first stone. It was half buried in moss, no bigger than a loaf of bread placed beside the trail with its flat face turned upward. 10 feet ahead sat another, then another. A boundary, maybe, or a marker. He crouched and brushed wet leaves away with his gloved hand. The stones were too evenly spaced to be accidental. A little farther in, the land changed without announcing itself. The wild tangle thinned. The trees stood in rows. Not perfect rows, not the kind a surveyor would admire from a drone, but close enough that the old training in Ethan's eye woke up. He looked left, then right, and felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. These were not volunteer trees. Someone had set them here, someone had chosen distance, slope, drainage, sun. Ranger trotted ahead and stopped beside a walnut with a straight trunk and high, clean limbs. He scratched once at the leaf litter near its base, then stepped back. Ethan knelt. Beneath the dark mat of leaves, his fingers struck metal. He dug gently, careful now, and pulled free a small aluminum tag wired to an old cedar stake. Mud filled the stamped letters. He rubbed it clean with his thumb. A.W. Row 14, 1991. The woods seemed to grow quieter around him. Ethan looked up at the walnut again, really looked this time. The trunk rose with a disciplined grace, free of low knots, its bark dark and furrowed like an old man's hands. Beyond it, more walnuts climbed the slope, their limbs spaced by years of pruning. He could see the cuts now, healed over in smooth collars, work hidden in plain sight, patience disguised as wilderness. Ranger moved again, leading him deeper. Past rows of trees the town had called useless because nobody had bothered to walk 50 yards beyond the gate. Ethan's boots sank into damp soil. His breath came white in the cold. Every few steps another sign appeared. A rotted length of protective wire, a faded strip of survey tape, a handmade water bar cut into the trail to slow erosion. Arthur had not abandoned this place. He had been speaking to it for decades in a language of cut stakes, stones, and seasons. At the top of a small rise, Ethan turned and looked back toward the road, though he could no longer see it. For years, people had driven past this hill and seen nothing worth stopping for. Maybe they had looked at him the same way when he came home, quiet, worn down, difficult to understand from a distance. Ranger returned to his side and leaned lightly against his leg. Ethan swallowed, feeling something loosen in his chest. Not joy yet, but the first fragile edge of wonder. "What were you doing out here, Grandpa?" he whispered. Ranger's ears lifted toward the trees, and from somewhere farther in, beyond the rows of walnut and the curve of the hill, a loose shutter tapped once in the wind. The sound came again. A soft wooden knock carried through the trees, and Ranger turned toward it as if someone had called his name. Ethan followed him down the far side of the rise, where the walnut rows gave way to a shallow hollow protected from the wind by hemlock and mountain laurel. At first he saw only shadow, then a roofline appeared beneath a quilt of fallen leaves, a small cabin, low and square, built from rough cedar boards gone silver with age. It leaned a little, not from neglect exactly, but from having stood through more winters than anyone had thanked it for. A tin gutter sagged above the door. One shutter hung loose, tapping when the wind reached under it. Ranger walked straight to the threshold and sat. He did not scratch. He did not bark. He waited. Ethan stood there with his gloved hand resting on the latch, feeling foolishly nervous, as if he were about to step into a room where the dead might still be working. The door resisted at first, swollen by weather, then gave with a long wooden sigh. Inside, the air smelled of paper, old sap, mouse dust, and the faint mineral damp of earth. Ethan swept his flashlight across the room. Not abandoned, that was the first truth. Not forgotten, that was the second. A narrow workbench ran along the back wall, its surface crowded with pruning shears, grafting knives, twine, pencils worn almost to nothing, rolls of flagging tape, and small aluminum tags sorted in coffee cans. A pair of muddy boots sat beside the door, toes pointed toward the woods, as if Arthur had only stepped out for a minute and would be back before supper. On one wall hung maps, hand-drawn and layered with decades of notes. 72 acres divided into blocks, rows, slopes, drainage lines, soil types, windbreaks, and sun exposure. Ethan moved closer, his breath shallow. Block A, Black Walnut, 1988. Block C, Grafted Selects, 1996. North Slope, thin in 2027. Creek Edge, Protect, no cutting. Near the window sat a stack of notebooks wrapped in oilcloth. Ranger rose and nudged the lowest one with his nose. Ethan unwrapped it carefully. Arthur's handwriting filled the pages, steady at first, then thinner in later years, but never careless. Dates, rainfall, seed sources, graft success sources, graft success rates. Notes about blight, deer pressure, late frost, soil amendments. Ethan turned page after page while the cabin seemed to breathe around him. His grandfather had not been wandering out here to escape the family. He had been building something the family had been too impatient to understand. In the corner, Ethan found a cedar chest with his initials burned into the lid, EW. His fingers trembled once before he opened it. Inside lay a folded canvas jacket, Arthur's old grafting knife, a bundle of photographs, and a sealed envelope. Ethan sat on the bench because his legs no longer trusted themselves. Ranger settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. The envelope was addressed in Arthur's plain hand. "Ethan, when you finally walk far enough in." He opened it slowly. The letter was only one page. Arthur had never wasted words. Ethan read it once, then again, because some sentences do not enter a man all at once. Blake sees the counter. Owen sees the roof. You, son, always saw the roots. I did not leave you what was easiest to count. I left you what took the longest to love. These trees are not a fortune unless you make them one the wrong way. They are a promise. Take slowly. Leave more than you take. Let the land teach you how to stay. Ethan lowered the page. The cabin blurred, then steadied. He pressed his thumb against the corner of the paper and thought of all the years Arthur came home with mud on his boots and quiet satisfaction in his face. 40 years of mornings, 40 years of pruning what no one praised, protecting what no one valued, trusting that someday the right person would stand in this little room and understand. Outside, wind moved through the walnut branches with a dry, patient whisper. Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog's amber eyes held his, calm and sure, as if he had known the answer long before Ethan was ready to ask the question. He didn't forget me, Ethan said, barely above a breath. Ranger leaned his weight against him, and in that small cedar cabin, surrounded by maps, blades, notebooks, and the quiet architecture of a lifetime, Ethan Walker felt the first true shape of his inheritance. It was not land. It was not timber. It was not even money waiting in the trees. It was trust, planted row by row until it became a forest. Ethan did not sleep much that night. The notebooks lay spread across the small kitchen table in his rental cabin, their pages held open by coffee mugs, a pocket knife, and Ranger's heavy paw whenever the dog decided Ethan had been staring too long. Rain tapped softly at the windows. The old wall heater clicked inside. Outside, Millstone Ridge went on believing Arthur Walker had left his quiet grandson a burden, while inside, Ethan sat beneath the yellow kitchen light trying to understand the shape of a miracle. Black walnut, grafted select lines, veneer potential, selective harvest, riparian buffer. Words he knew in pieces from Arthur's old lessons, but not enough to trust himself with what they meant now. By morning, he drove to Larkspur, a smaller town 20 miles west, where Clara Whitcomb lived in a white farmhouse tucked behind a windbreak of spruce. Arthur had mentioned her name years ago with the kind of respect he rarely gave aloud. "Clara can read a tree the way some folks read scripture," he had said. She answered the door in a canvas coat and wool socks, gray hair braided over one shoulder, sharp blue eyes moving from Ethan's face to Ranger, and then to the oilcloth-wrapped notebooks in his arms. "You're Arthur's boy," she said, "not grandson. Not heir boy." The word should have made Ethan feel small, but it did not. From her it sounded like belonging. Clara did not waste time on sympathy. She cleared her breakfast plates from the table, opened the first notebook and began reading. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Her expression changed only once. When she reached the map marked Block C, Grafted Selects, 1996, she removed her glasses, rubbed one thumb along the bridge of her nose, and whispered, "Oh, Arthur, you stubborn old saint." By noon, they were at Pine Hollow. Clara walked the land slowly. Stopping so often, Ethan had to shorten his stride. Ranger stayed a few paces ahead, proud and solemn, as if escorting a judge through a cathedral. Clara measured trunks with a diameter tape. She studied bark, limb structure, spacing, slope, and crown competition. She knelt to examine soil. She followed Arthur's stone markers without needing Ethan to point them out. The farther they went, the quieter she became. At last, beneath a stand of tall walnuts on the south-facing ridge, she stood with one palm against a straight, dark trunk and looked up into the bare branches. "Your grandfather didn't plant trees," she said. "He planted time." Ethan waited. He had learned in the service, and then from Arthur, that the most important part of listening was not rushing to fill the space after someone told the truth. Clara turned toward him. "If someone came in here careless, cut everything merchantable, and hauled it out fast, this land might bring 1.2, maybe $1.4 million before taxes and fees, maybe more if the veneer buyers got competitive." The number did not feel real. Ethan looked across the slope at the trees, and for one unsteady second he saw Blake's face, saw the polished boots, the $25,000 offer, the soft insult dressed as help. Then Clara kept speaking, and the number became smaller than the warning inside it. But that would be the crude way, the greedy way. Arthur's notes are clear. This is not a clear cut. This is a managed legacy. Selective harvest, long rotation, protect the creek edge, thin the weak, leave the best. Done right. This land can support itself, support you, and still be standing when everyone who mocked it is gone. Ranger moved beside Ethan and leaned against his leg. Ethan put a hand on the dog's head, more for himself than for Ranger. "Why me?" he asked. Clara studied him, not unkindly. "Because Arthur knew the difference between a man who wants value and a man who can honor it." The words settled harder than the money. Ethan looked at the rows again. For years he had believed usefulness was something he had to prove. To his commanders, to doctors, to his brothers, to a town that greeted him politely, but never quite knew where to place him. Yet here was a whole hillside, proving that worth could live quietly under bark, under scar tissue, under seasons of being misunderstood. Clara touched one of the old pruning scars, healed smooth around the cut. "People do this to each other too," she said. "They see rough ground and assume nothing good can grow there. They see a quiet man and assume he has nothing to say. They see age, grief, injury, debt, disappointment, and they call it the whole story." Arthur knew better. Ethan did not answer. If he had tried, his voice would have failed him. Instead, he watched Ranger step forward and stop at the next metal tag, waiting patiently for the humans to catch up. News travels differently in a small town. It does not run. It leans across counters, rides in the passenger seat of pickup trucks, settles into church vestibules and hardware aisles, and by the time anyone admits they have heard it, the thing has already grown legs. 3 days after Clara walked Pine Hollow, Blake appeared at Ethan's cabin with a leather folder under one arm and a smile he had polished on the drive over. Owen came with him, though he stood half a step behind, hands in the pockets of his work coat, eyes fixed on Ranger as if the dog might be kinder to look at than his own brother. Ranger stood on the porch between Ethan and the two men, not blocking them, not threatening them, simply present. The late afternoon was cold enough to turn breath white. A line of geese crossed the gray sky above the ridge, their calls fading toward the river. Blake did not comment on the weather. Men in a hurry rarely notice the sky. "We need to talk about the land," he said. Ethan leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "Funny. Last week it was a burden." A muscle moved in Blake's cheek, but the smile stayed. "Last week I didn't know Grandpa had been sitting on marketable walnut. Sitting on it." Ethan heard the phrase and felt something in him close. Arthur had not sat on anything. He had planted, pruned, thinned, marked, measured, protected. He had knelt in mud, while Blake stood behind the nursery counter, selling spring color to people who wanted beauty by Saturday. Blake opened the folder and pulled out a printed offer sheet, clean and bright against the weathered porch rail. "I spoke to a buyer in Ohio. High-end millwork. They can move fast. If we harvest the best stands now, we could clear close to $900,000 after handling costs, maybe more depending on veneer grade. Enough to stabilize the nursery, pay down debt, and keep the Walker name from sinking." There it was, finally. Not expansion, not opportunity. Debt. Ethan looked past Blake to Owen, whose face had gone tired and pale. "How much?" Blake's smile faltered. "That's business." "How much, Blake?" The wind moved through the bare trees behind the cabin. Owen answered before Blake could dress the truth. $420,000, maybe more with late fees. Blake turned on him with a look sharp enough to cut, then remembered himself and faced Ethan again. Temporary pressure, 5 rough years. Supply costs, 2 bad seasons, a greenhouse upgrade that ran over. You wouldn't understand. Ethan almost laughed, but the sound would have been too bitter to use. "I understand pressure." Blake's eyes dropped for half a second to Ethan's hip, then away. It was a small thing, but Ethan felt it. People were always glancing at the place where they thought your weakness lived. Ranger stepped forward and pressed his shoulder against Ethan's leg. Not alarmed, not restless, a quiet correction. "Stay here, stay steady." Owen removed his cap. "Ethan," he said, voice low, "I should said something at Price's office. I knew it wasn't right. I needed that house. Marjorie's mother can't manage stairs anymore, and rent's been eating us alive. That's not an excuse, I'm sorry." The apology sat on the porch like a fragile cup. Blake looked disgusted by it, but Ethan did not. He had waited most of his life for Owen to say one true thing without asking permission from someone louder. "I'm not selling the land," Ethan said. Blake's folder snapped shut. "You're going to let the nursery fail so you can play forest keeper?" "No," Ethan said. "I'm going to keep Grandpa's plan. Grandpa is gone." The words came too fast, and for the first time Blake's face showed what lived under the polish: fear. Not grief exactly. Fear of being seen as a man who had inherited the visible thing and still could not hold it together. Ethan softened, though not enough to bend. "That's why we don't get to spend the part of him that's still standing." Blake looked toward Pine Hollow as if the trees themselves had betrayed him. He gave it to the wrong brother. Ranger lifted his head. The dog did not growl. He simply looked at Blake with such steady attention that Blake stopped speaking. Ethan stepped down from the porch, close enough now to see the red in his brother's eyes. No. He gave it to the brother who wouldn't mistake cutting for caring. Owen lowered his gaze. Blake's mouth opened, then closed. For a long moment, all 3 men stood in the cold with Arthur's absence between them, and none of them knew how to cross it. Ethan did not open Pine Hollow to prove Blake wrong. That would have been too small a reason for a place Arthur had spent 40 years making large. At first he opened only the gate. He cut back enough brush for a person to walk without tearing a coat. He rehung the old sign, Not with new paint or bright letters, but with the original board cleaned and sealed, so the faded name could keep its dignity. Walker Quiet Acres. Clara said it sounded like a place where the land might finally be allowed to speak, and Ethan liked that better than anything grand. Word spread slowly. A retired mail carrier came first, a widower named George Maddox, who said he had known Arthur when they were both young enough to believe knees lasted forever. He walked only half the trail, stopping often to catch his breath. But every time he paused, Ranger paused with him, patient as a church bell after the ringing. Then came 2 former service members from the County Veterans Center, a woman named Dana Pierce, who had once been a mechanic in the Air Force, and a quiet man named Luis Romero, who carried grief in his shoulders like a coat he could not remove. They did not come for therapy. Ethan hated how people used that word when they meant fixing. They came because Clara had told them there was land that needed careful hands, and careful hands had a way of reminding a person they were still useful. On the first Saturday, Ethan showed them how to clear invasive vines from young chestnuts without damaging the bark. On the second, Clara taught them how to read a tree's crown for stress. On the third, they walked the creek buffer and placed stones where spring rain had been cutting into the bank. No one gave speeches. No one asked anyone to confess what hurt. Work did what Arthur had always trusted work to do. It put people side by side instead of face to face, and sometimes that was the only way a person could begin. Ranger became the keeper of the trail. He knew which visitors needed room and which needed his head under their hand. With George, he walked slow. With Dana, he stood close but never crowded. With Luis, who rarely spoke, Ranger would sit beside the same walnut stump every week, until the man finally rested his palm on the dog's neck and let out one long breath that sounded like a door opening after years of weather. Ethan saw it and looked away, not from discomfort, but from respect. Some moments were not meant to be witnessed to directly. One afternoon, a local reporter asked if the land was becoming a business. Ethan thought of Blake, of the offer sheet, of numbers printed clean enough to hide what they cost. No, he said. It's becoming honest. The reporter frowned, waiting for a better quote, but Ethan had given the only one he had. Walker Quiet Acres did not charge admission. People donated when they could. A small college forestry program sent adult students to study Arthur's notebooks. A furniture maker from Lancaster offered to buy only selected trees under Clara's plan and agreed to label every finished piece with the story of sustainable harvest. Ethan allowed it on one condition: no one would call the wood rescued. It was never lost, he said. People just didn't know how to see it. That became the lesson of the place, though no sign ever said so. A person could arrive worn down, overlooked, gray at the edges, limping in body or spirit, and no one at Pine Hollow would ask them to explain why they were not blooming. The land itself answered that. Roots did their work in darkness. Bark carried scars without apology. The finest timber grew slowly, often in places passed by men who preferred quick profit to quiet worth. Even Blake came once, though he pretended he was only checking road access. Ethan saw him standing at the edge of row 14, one hand on a walnut trunk, his face stripped of its usual confidence. He did not call out. He let his brother have the silence. Ranger walked over first and sat beside Blake, not forgiving him for Ethan, not accusing him either, just sitting. After a while, Blake removed his hand from the tree and looked toward the slope, where Dana and Luis were clearing brush around the chestnuts. "Grandpa really did all this?" he asked. Ethan stood a few feet away. "Yes," Blake swallowed, and we drove past it. Ethan looked over the rows, the markers, the careful distance between things. Most people do. The first hard frost came on a Tuesday, silvering the grass so completely that Pine Hollow looked as if the night had breathed glass over everything and left before morning. Ethan arrived before sunrise, with Ranger in the truck and Arthur's North Slope notebook on the seat between them. Clara had marked several areas for winter thinning, but Ethan could not keep his attention on the work. For 3 nights, the same line in Arthur's map had bothered him, written in pencil near the upper ridge where the land bent toward the old quarry road. For EW when he comes home. He had read it a dozen times. He had closed the book, opened it again, told himself not to make too much of 5 words from a man who had labeled everything, who named rows the way other men named tools. But the words followed him into sleep and waited for him when he woke. Ranger knew before Ethan did. The dog jumped from the truck, sniffed the cold air, and turned not toward the main walnut stand, but toward the narrow deer path climbing north. "That's not where we're working," Ethan said. Ranger looked back once, not impatient, certain. Then he started up the slope. Ethan followed, because by then he had learned that Ranger's certainty was often a kind of remembering. The hill was steeper than it looked from below. Frost cracked under Ethan's boots. His hip complained in dull pulses, and his breath came out in short white clouds. Halfway up, he stopped beside a stone marker and rested one hand on a young walnut trunk. Young, at least compared with the great trees in row 14. This stand had slimmer bodies, clean and straight, each tree protected years ago by wire guards now loosened and rusted. They were not random. 24 trees, maybe more, set along the ridge in two quiet lines where morning sun would reach them first. Ranger walked to the first tree and sat. Ethan found the tag wired low to the stake, AWEW Ridge 2014. He stared at the date until it became more than a number, 2014. The year he stopped calling home for months at a time. The year he had lived out west in a rented room above a machine shop, eating standing up, sleeping badly, telling himself distance was a form of mercy. Arthur had planted trees for him that year. Not because Ethan had promised to return, not because anyone could prove he would. Arthur had planted them anyway. Ranger rose and led him to the next tree, then the next. Each carried a tag. Each tag held the same initials. E.W. Ethan reached the end of the row and found a flat stone set into the ground, almost covered by moss. Beneath it, tucked in a cedar box sealed with wax, was a small glass jar. His hands were clumsy with cold as he opened it. Inside was a photograph, curled at the edges but dry. Ethan at 19, thin and unsmiling in a stiff new jacket, standing beside Arthur behind the nursery greenhouse. Between them sat Scout, Arthur's old German shepherd, ears high, eyes bright, one paw resting on Ethan's boot. Ethan had forgotten the picture existed. On the back, in Arthur's handwriting, were the words, "Some men need a road back, so I planted one." The ridge blurred. Ethan sat down because standing suddenly felt like pretending. He held the photograph in both hands while the cold worked through his jeans and into his knees. For years, he had carried a private belief that leaving had made him less worthy of being waited for. He had thought love was something a man could forfeit by staying gone too long, by answering letters too late, by returning quieter than he left. But Arthur had answered absence with roots. He had taken the year Ethan disappeared inside himself and placed living things in the ground, trusting them to hold a place his grandson might not yet know how to claim. Ranger eased down beside him and leaned his warm shoulder into Ethan's ribs. Ethan bent over the dog, one hand in the thick fur at his neck, and for the first time in a long while, he did not try to stop what rose in him. The sound that came out was not loud. It was almost nothing, a breath breaking open. The trees stood around him without judgment. They did not ask why he had left, or why he had taken so long, or why he had needed a dog to lead him back to a grandfather who had been speaking in seasons all along. Above the ridge, the sun finally cleared the far hills, laying gold along the young walnut branches. Ethan looked down the two rows Arthur had planted for him, and understood that inheritance was not always what someone handed you after death. Sometimes it was the path they kept open while you were still too lost to walk it. "I'm home," he whispered. Ranger lifted his head, ears forward, as if he had been waiting years for those two words. By the following autumn, Pine Hollow no longer looked forgotten, but Ethan was careful that it never looked conquered. The gate still opened with a groan. The old road still curved through brush and stone. The cabin still smelled of paper, cedar, and rain. But the trail was clear now, the creek bank steadier, the young chestnuts freed from strangling vines, and the walnut rows marked with small metal tags that caught the morning light like quiet signatures. Clara's plan had become the law of the place. Take slowly, leave more than you take. That September, 3 mature walnuts came down, selected not because they were the largest, but because the stand needed room to breathe. Ethan was there when the forester marked them. He stood with one hand on Ranger's back and felt no triumph in it, only responsibility. The trees had not been wasted. Their lumber went to a craftsman in Lancaster who promised to make conference tables, cabinet fronts, and one small writing desk from the best veneer. Each finished piece would carry a brass plate. From Walker Quiet Acres, managed in honor of Arthur Walker, who believed worth should never be rushed. After taxes, fees, and conservation costs, the first sale brought in $86,000. Blake expected a lecture. Ethan could see it in the stiff way his brother arrived at the cabin, shoulders braced, pride already bandaged before the wound came. But Ethan had no appetite for punishment. Punishment was easy. Arthur had left him something harder. He gave Owen enough to repair the old house properly. New ramp, safer bathroom, a heating system that did not cough smoke every January. Owen tried to refuse twice, then cried without making a sound, his cap pressed against his chest. For Blake, Ethan offered help with the nursery, but not rescue without change. The books would be opened. The debt would be restructured. Clara would advise on native trees and sustainable stock. Owen would have a vote. Ethan would have a vote. The Walker name would no longer belong to the loudest man in the room. Blake stared at the papers for a long time. "You could have let me lose it," he said. Ethan looked through the window toward the ridge, where Ranger was sleeping in a square of sun. "Grandpa didn't teach me how to clear-cut people either." Blake's face shifted then, not into gratitude exactly, but into something less armored. It was a beginning, and beginnings, Ethan knew now, rarely looked impressive from the road. On the first Saturday of October, they planted 72 walnut saplings along the eastern edge of Pine Hollow. Not for profit, not for proof. For the next hands that would need shade. George Maddox came with his cane and insisted on pressing soil around one tree himself. Dana Pierce tied the first tag. Luis Romero, who now spoke a little more each week, carried water in 2 dented buckets and poured carefully at every root. Owen planted 3 trees without talking, then stood back wiping his eyes with the heel of his hand. Blake planted one near the rise where Arthur's old cabin could be seen through the branches. He worked awkwardly, too much force at first, then slower after Ethan showed him how to loosen the roots. Ranger moved from person to person, gray showing around his muzzle, accepting muddy hands on his neck like blessings. When the last sapling was set, Ethan knelt and fastened the final tag to a cedar stake. It did not carry a price, a row number, or a family claim. Just one word: respect. The wind moved through the older walnuts, and their branches answered with a dry golden whisper. Ethan thought of Arthur's boots by the cabin door, the notebooks, the letter, the photograph, the road planted for a man who had forgotten how to come home. He looked at his brothers, at Clara, at the people standing quietly among the young trees, and understood that the land had done what money never could. It had made them stay long enough to see one another. People in Millstone Ridge used to say Arthur Walker left Ethan the worthless land. They said Blake got the business, Owen got the house, and Ethan got the brush. But people are often wrong from a distance. Arthur had left him a forest, a purpose, a loyal dog who remembered the way, and a family not fixed, not perfect, but finally willing to grow. If this story reminded you that people, like forests, should never be judged from a distance, give it a like and subscribe for more stories that stay with you. Tell me in the comments which moment touched you most and where you're watching from tonight.